Welcome back to our series on World War I. Today, after discussing last time the weapons of World War I, we'll be talking a little bit about the strategy and tactics, and particularly the first very important battle of World War I, the Battle of the Marne. It's important to understand when you take a look at this battle that the Germans come this close to winning not only that battle, but also the war in those first weeks of World War I. Before we talk specifically about the battle, we have to know that the Germans had already accomplished what they hoped to accomplish in World War I previously. In 1870, they had already defeated the French, and the battle had, the entire war had lasted less than a few months, and they defeated the French. And so they are very confident that they can win quickly. The leader of the French, or of the German army at that time, was a guy called Helmut von Moltke. Moltke was a very adept military leader in Germany, and he was responsible for that victory in 1870. I say that because in 1914, his nephew, another von Moltke, is in charge of the German army at the time. And again, we'll see what happens to that von Moltke and how he conducts the battle. The first week of August, all the way to the midway in September, is the period that we kind of call the Battle of the Marne. It's from the beginning of hostilities between Germany and France, and it also brings in England. And it brings in England because the British Empire was brought into the war because the German army decided that the quickest way to Paris was to go through Belgium. And of course, when they go through Belgium, Great Britain had guaranteed Belgian neutrality, and when the Germans attack Belgium, before they get into France, the English come in. So the original plan for the German offensive in France was written in 1905, some 9 years before the actual war. It was their war plan. It was called the Schlieffen Plan, and it was General von Schlieffen, a German, who devised the plan. He had already passed away before 1914, but the German plan is pretty much based upon what he wanted to do. And let me give you a quick summary of the Schlieffen Plan. The Schlieffen Plan meant that German forces would attack in the south, but not very strongly. Their main attack was going to occur in the north, and they were going to come around and into Paris in this route. So the major portion of the German attack was going to be up here. Here's the English Channel, and you can see just a bit of England right here. So this was called the Schlieffen Plan. In fact, von Schlieffen, and this is probably not true, but the saying was that on his deathbed, he said, let the last Pomeranian grenadier, Pomeranians from Prussia, from Berlin, brush the Channel with his sleeve. He wanted to make sure that they came all the way very close to the English Channel before they veered onto Paris. We're going to see that during the actual battle, von Moltke turned a little bit sooner, and that turn sooner is going to probably make the difference and why France was able to hold and then push the Germans back.
So this is Belgium?
This is Belgium right here. You'll see Brussels.
Yes.
Okay, and in retrospect, you see Paris down here. So this area here is Belgium, and this is Paris. So the Germans have to go through Belgium, and when they go through Belgium, as I said before, it's at that point, even though the Germans were at war officially with Russia and France, but they're not officially at war with Belgium or with Great Britain until they invade Belgium. Belgium had originally said, we're neutral in this thing, we don't want any part of it. But when the Germans attack through Belgium, of course, Belgium has to fight. And when they fight, Great Britain comes in. And they send an expeditionary force immediately to France. So that's the start of the war. We don't want to look at the maps yet, but I want to get them ready. Okay, so the Schlieffen Plan of 1905 was one of what we call a war of maneuver. They didn't anticipate getting into a trench situation. We saw pictures of the trenches last time, where it was static warfare. Everybody was sitting in a trench back and forth, and they were actually moving. And there's a lot of movement that to take into account here, because we're talking about hundreds of miles that the Germans have to attack through. So when they come through Belgium and on their way to Paris, we're talking about that they have to move 150 to 200 miles in maneuver. And it's important to understand at this time that though there were motorized vehicles, the majority, the vast majority, 90% of the vehicles or the troops were moving either by on foot or by horses. And it's important to understand also that horses, along with people, have a thing called fatigue. They get tired. They need food. And the farther that the Germans advance, the more difficult it is to supply not only their troops, but their horses. And so you're going to see an attack that starts out quickly, slows down considerably, and it allows the French to take their forces, their reserves in particular, and bring them to the front. I can't overemphasize how important those things are. The other thing to remember is that as the German troops are moving as quickly as possible, and they are moving and pushing the French back, they are not sleeping. And one historian only recently has said that the major problem with the German army in the initial phases of the World War I and that attack on that ends up at the Marne was the fact that their troops were absolutely and completely tired. You were usually marching anywhere from 10 to 20 miles a day, and almost had very or no sleep whatsoever. And you can't do that for more than 2 or 3 weeks at a time without completely being fatigued and unable to fight. And so that's one of the major issues. Major issue is logistics, meaning supplying those troops, because the farther Germans get into France, the more difficult it is to supply them, and then fatigue, just being too tired to do anything. So the Germans do initiate their attack through Belgium, and you can see, and these are broken lines. The red lines are Germans, and you can see the arrows attacking. They attack just a little bit down here, but the main attack comes through Belgium, as I said before, and swings in toward Paris. You can see Paris down here. So you can see that the attack doesn't go like Schlieffen. Schlieffen wanted the attack to come around this way and down. Von Moltke decides that he's got the French on the run. He's going to destroy their armies down here. And the Germans actually do get within artillery range of Paris itself. So they almost win the war right here. It's very important to understand that the Germans come within a sliver of winning the war right here. So why do they lose? Well, they lose, as I said before, from a logistical standpoint, the fact that they can't supply their troops. Their troops are running out of ammunition. More importantly, they're running out of food, and they're very tired. But they do push the French back here. The French, in the meantime, are close to their lines of supply out of Paris, and so they can supply their forces well. And they come up with the idea that it's about time to counterattack. And they get their reserves, who have now been mobilized, not the regular army, which is already fighting the war, but the mobilization of their reserves are also able to be fed into the line. And so here you can see, again, Paris. You can see the frontier here. And the French realized that the Germans had not had a continuous line of defense all the way through here. They detected an opening, and that's where they decide to counterattack. And so the French reserves in particular, brought up from Paris and other places in France, attack. There's a myth, and this myth was generated during the war, that the French put everything they could into bringing their reserves to the front. And that part is true. The myth is that they put them in taxi cabs and brought them from Paris. They loaded taxi cabs from Paris and brought them into the front. And that was the reason the French were able to hold back the Germans and counterattack. It was the taxi cab myth. it was a French origin. It is true they probably transported about 6,000 troops, but there were over 100,000 new French reserves, so the taxi cab myth was just that. It wasn't the deciding factor by any means. The French counterattack does occur here. They break through the German lines. Once they break through the German lines, you can see that these Germans are then threatened because they could turn and go to their rear. And you're going to see, again, the counterattack occurring and the Germans retreating. Here's Paris again. And they retreat over 100 kilometers to the rear right here. The dotted line means that this was the front initially after the counterattack, and I'm going to talk a little bit about this, what happens a bit later. But during this counterattack, which was very successful from the French standpoint, von Moltke himself, the head of the German army, the head of the German attack, suffers a nervous breakdown. And in fact goes to the Kaiser Wilhelm and says, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." It's important to understand that he says this in September 1914. 4 years of fighting are going to occur. Millions and millions of men are going to die after von Moltke said, "Your Majesty, we have lost the war." Well, the French counterattack occurs, and the next part of the Battle of the Marne is called the Race to the Sea. And what happens then is that both sides are trying to outflank the other, and instead they're just building an attack line along here until they go all the way to the North Sea. And as I mentioned before, then they start digging in. The Germans are tired. They don't want to attack anymore. They don't have the means to attack, but they want to hold the ground that they took. So they control most of Belgium and a large portion of France here. So it's important to understand that the entire war for 4 years is going to be fought in Belgium and France. And it's also important to understand that the lines change very, very little. Anywhere from 10 to 30 to 40 miles are going to happen during 4 years of combat and millions of death. And in fact, on November 11th, 1918, 4 years after the war had been going on, after 4 years, in fact, nothing had been achieved. The Germans were still in Belgium and France, pretty much along this very line, after bloody fighting. And why is that important? It's important when we start talking about the origins of World War II. Because the Germans were in France and Belgium, yet they surrender. They give up their forces, they give up the war, and then they are blamed for the war. So it's important to understand why a person like Adolf Hitler, later in the 1920s and 30s, will say, "How could we have lost? We were in fact in Belgium and France at the end of the war." Okay, are there any questions?
No, I don't have any.
Okay, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you next time. We'll talk again about some of the major battles of the war. We'll also be talking about the air war. We're going to be talking about the naval war. We're going to be talking a little bit about soldier life, and I think we'll have a lot of very interesting things to cover. Thank you.
I also wanted to add, if you'd like to subscribe, if you'd like to see more videos, just subscribe on the YouTube station. Also, if you would if you have any questions or have a request that you'd like Tom to speak on, please put it in the comments on YouTube. Have a great day.